Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to invite you to open in your New Testament to John chapter 5. John chapter 5 is a beginning place. As you're turning there, I want to welcome you to the Sea of Galilee. I don't know what I'm doing wearing a coat and tie at the Sea of Galilee. This would have been just the opportunity I was looking for to wear something a little more casual, and I missed it. But we're glad you're here. We look forward to this week in which we will have our VBS. And during our VBS, we're going to talk a lot about some of the miracles that Jesus performed. And what we're going to talk about this morning in our lesson is just kind of the miracles of Jesus, just the significance of those things. But I want to begin first with a story not from the Bible. It's a story from Mark Twain's classic called Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. And it's a story about a man from the late 1800s when Mark Twain would have been writing the book. His name was Hank Morgan, and in the book he gets hit on the head and he is somehow transported back to the days of King Arthur. And because Hank knew some things that they didn't know in the days of King Arthur, he was able to convince the king and others that he was a powerful magician. And at one point in the book, there is another magician who comes on the scene who kind of threatens his position at Camelot. People are starting to become impressed with this other guy. And this other magician claimed to have the ability to know what any person on earth was doing at any point in time. And so he would give details about what people were doing, thousands of miles away. And as Mark Twain put it in the book, the people were ready to take up with an adventurer who could offer no evidence of his powers, but his mere unproven word. And so Hank knew that if he didn't act quickly, this upstart wonder worker would have his job. And so to expose him, Hank gave this other magician a simple test. He held something behind his back, and he challenged the magician to reveal what it was. Because here's the thing. If you can tell me what people are doing thousands of miles away, surely you know what's going on behind my back 10 feet, however many feet away. And so, that's the test that he gave him. It's an easy test. And of course, this other magician failed miserably. And with his failure exposing him as a fraud, his budding career at Arthur's court came to an end. Now, here's the reason I told you that story. It seems to me that many people believe that the claims of the New Testament concerning Jesus are a lot like the claims of that so-called magician. In essence, they say that the gospel accounts offer no evidence, but they're mere unproven words. And what I find interesting about the New Testament is that it doesn't ask people to follow Jesus on the basis of unproven words. It doesn't do that. In fact, even Jesus himself would ask people to test or to prove his claims, to see whether or not he was what he claimed to be. And so here in John chapter 5 and verse 31, Jesus makes this statement. He says, "If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. There is another who bears witness about me, and I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true." And so far from shying away from proof, Jesus he insisted on it. And the reason for that is because objective proof is the foundation upon which our faith stands. And so we don't want to be guilty of accepting testimony that's not true. People do that all the time, but we don't want to be guilty of that. And the New Testament encourages us to test the things, to test what we are presented with before we accept them. The Apostle John, for example, 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1, would say, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world." I've said before, now this won't be the last time, the truth does not fear investigation. And so one thing I believe we need to recognize is that not all things can be tested or proven in exactly the same way. Different propositions require different kinds of proof. And unless you match the right proof with the right proposition, you're probably going to miss the truth entirely. And so just because a proposition can't be proven one way doesn't mean it's unprovable or it's untrue. And so proving that a proposition is true or that it's false requires that we use the right standard of judgment. In fact, I'm going to put a quote up here, basically talking about this same basic subject. I think I'm going to put a quote up here. I didn't give Shane a quote to put up there, did I, Shane? No. Shane is not a good magician. He's just not. He required my input in that, and Jeff completely forgot to hand him the thing. So we're going to do sleight of hand and pretend that it's up there, and how about I read it to you? We'll just do it the old-fashioned way. A method which is rightly applied to one field may be out of order when applied to another. When one tries to prove something by a method which is unsuited to the realm to which one applies it, he cannot come up with the correct answer. This failure doesn't mean that a certain area of experience does not exist, nor that there is no truth in that area. It means that one has made the mistake of demanding proof by means of a method unsuited to the field. He has asked the method to settle something with which it cannot deal. And so let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. There is no mathematical formula that you could come up with that could prove that Jesus existed. Just can't do it. But here's why that shouldn't really trouble you. Because there's no mathematical formula by which I could prove that you exist either, or that I exist. And yet, here we are. And so most of what we know, most of what is known empirically. That is, it's known by means of observation and by experience. And so when we say that water freezes at 32 degrees, or when we say that the polio vaccine prevents polio, or when we say that Abraham Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater, we're making claims that can only be proven empirically by what is observed. And so science and medicine and history and law and just about every other matter of personal significance involves empirical evidence. So when a doctor makes a diagnosis, or when a jury reaches a verdict, or when a scientist lectures on atoms, they all do so on the basis of knowledge that is gained through the senses. And once you step outside the narrow realm of mathematical certainty, you're in the broad realm of the empirical, where the five senses are constantly used to receive information and analyze information and to verify all sorts of data from which we then draw conclusions. We reach, a conclusion based on all of that. And so when we talk about evidence for the existence of God, or about the reliability of the Bible, or about the identity of Jesus, we're ultimately talking about empirical evidence. And so I want us to talk about the identity of Jesus some this morning, and I want us to see that there is overwhelming empirical evidence to verify the claims that we read about in the Gospels. And the evidence that establishes the identity of Jesus is a matter of history. And so the same processes that have been used to, I didn't just pull this one out of my hat because I'm not that good at history, but to prove that the Persians were defeated by the Greeks at the city of Marathon. The way we can prove that is that's the same kind of thing that we would use to prove the events that we read about in the Gospels. And so one of the main reasons some people have a hard time accepting the Gospel accounts as history is because of the miraculous events that occur in them. And so we live at a time when scientists have mapped the human genome, and when scientists have dissected the atom, and when they've peered through the James Webb telescope into the distant reaches of the universe, and supposedly these things are meant to be sufficient to chase away naive belief in the supernatural. At least that's the way it's told sometimes. But when we look at the Bible, what we find is that it not only has a remarkably unified message, one that was written over the course of about 1,500 years or so by 40 or so different authors, which is amazing all by itself. But it also is a message that is perfectly consistent with historically verifiable information. So you can't go back to the scriptures and have some go, this just didn't really work like this, and so you can just throw away your Bible. It doesn't work like that. It has all the characteristics of historical writings. And the only reason there is to reject the Bible's claims of miraculous activity is presupposition. and bias. And so, in essence, the critics claim this: Jesus didn't perform miracles because we know miracles are impossible. That's really ultimately what they have to say. And I don't know anybody who claims to be omniscient, but that's what you would have to believe in order to make a claim like that. If there is a God, then miracles are possible. It's as simple as that. And to think that God is somehow bound by the laws that he put into place to govern the universe that he created, that is not logical. He can suspend them at will. We cannot. I mean, you can believe that you have the ability to suspend the law of gravity with you if you want to, but don't go jumping off stuff with that. It's not going to work. And so we cannot do that, but God can. Only God is able to suspend the natural laws that he put in place to govern his creation. That's ultimately what miracles are. And that's why that's why Nicodemus in John chapter 3, when he came to Jesus by night, do you remember what he would say to him? He would say to him in John chapter 3 in verse 2, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God." All right, how do you know that, Nicodemus? "For no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." No mere man can suspend those things. And Nicodemus recognized that the miracles of Jesus proved that there was something different about him. Now, I'm not sure that Nicodemus understood that Jesus was the Son of God at this point, but he recognized that he was from God. And as far as he was concerned, there was no other way to explain the kinds of things that Jesus did. Ordinary people can't do what Jesus did. And so the miracles of Jesus weren't like what we see in, so-called miracle workers today. One thing you'll find if you were to watch religious programming today is that people will go up on stage and they will be quote unquote healed of things that are not obvious. I mean, it's not, clear that there's a problem to begin with. And so they may come up in a wheelchair or something like that, but I'll tell you what, anybody can ride in a wheelchair. And I'm not impressed when someone says that they have a pain in their neck and, a television preacher presses them on the forehead. Now they don't have a pain in their neck anymore. That doesn't impress me that much. The miracles of Jesus weren't like that. And there may have been times when maybe something was done that is not quite as easy to verify as a miracle, but many of the miracles of Jesus were obvious. And so when John the Baptist had his disciples, he was thrown into prison, and he had his disciples go to Jesus, and things looked different in a prison than they did out on the Jordan banks of the Jordan River. And so he wanted to know, are you the expected one? Did I get that right? Are we supposed to look for somebody else? And Jesus didn't say to John, you go and tell, or didn't say to his disciples, you go and tell John that he's going to have to take my word for it. He didn't do that. In Matthew chapter 11 and verses 4 and 5, he said, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and the poor have good news preached to them. Now, incidentally, that's one of the ways in which Jesus fulfilled prophecy. Some of the things Jesus mentioned here are directly talked about in the Old Testament about the one they were expecting. In Isaiah chapter 35 and verses 5 and 6, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. And so what Jesus sent the disciples of John to do was just to say, look at the evidence. Look at what's being done. And these miracles that Jesus was performing is just one of the many factors that pointed to him as being the long-awaited Messiah. And so when Jesus performed a miracle, there was often some evidence that it happened. The first thing Jesus pointed out to the disciples of John is that the blind received sight. And I suppose maybe that kind of thing could be faked in some way or another. But I want us to take just a moment to read a story that takes place in John chapter 9. John chapter 9. John chapter 9, we're going to start in verse 1. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned, or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." And having said these things, he spit upon the ground and made mud with the saliva. And then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. And so he went and washed, and he came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" And some said, "It's he." Others said, "No, but he's like him." But he kept saying, "I'm the man." And so they said to him, "Then how were your eyes open?" And he answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said, go to Siloam and wash. And so I went and washed and received my sight." And they said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know." You skip down a little bit, down to verse 18. Verse 18. It says, "The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, 'Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?' And his parents answered, 'We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he's of age, he will speak for himself.' And it says his parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. And therefore his parents said, 'He is of age, ask him.'" Can you see this is not a setup of some kind? I mean, the disciples of Jesus asked a question about a man that they just happened to be passing as they were traveling along during. They just wasn't set up on a stage or anything. And the neighbors of the man, they recognized him as the blind beggar, at least many of them did. His parents, who were called into this situation by the enemies of Jesus, testified that their son had been blind from birth. They weren't followers of Jesus. And they had no reason to lie about it. Let's take a minute. Let's look at another story. Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12. And we're going to start reading in verse 8 this time. Hopefully I won't cough my way through this one. In Matthew chapter 12, in verse 9 actually, he went on from there and entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So is it lawful to do good? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And that's exactly what he did. Can you see the difference there between what Jesus did and what is often done today? A man with the hand that was shriveled, that is restored like new immediately. And so when we go through and we look at the miracles of Jesus, that is the kind of thing that we see. And over again, you see that same pattern. In Luke chapter 7 and verse 11, we read a remarkable story that goes like this. "Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her, and when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said, 'Do not weep.' And then he came up and he touched the casket, and the bearers stood still, and he said, 'Young man, I say to you, arise.' And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother." That's not something you're going to see today. You are never going to see someone who claims to be able to perform miracles today interrupt a funeral procession and raise someone from the dead. And the reason you'll never see something like that today is because you can't fake something like that. And so when you look at the miracles of Jesus, they can't really be explained any other way. They weren't mere sleight of hand or trickery or anything like that. They often involved elements that couldn't be controlled or they couldn't be manipulated in some way. And I think that's at least one of the reasons why Jesus chose to perform miracles like these. In John chapter 10, Jesus would say to those who were listening to him, "If I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father." You see that Jesus simply wanted people to look at the evidence, and the empirical evidence backed up the claims that were made about Jesus, the claims that he made about himself. He was different. People recognized that he was different. He did things that no one else did. And when people honestly evaluated that, the only thing they could do is fall at his feet and become his disciples. I had a couple more things that I was going to talk about this morning, but I don't think they're going to work this morning, so I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. And I hope that, for our young folks, that you'll be here tomorrow and we'll get to talk about Jesus doing some remarkable things. He cared about people, for one, and he helped people. And he did great things because he is the Son of God. He came into this world because he loves me and he loves you, and he wants us to have a relationship with God. And if you're here this morning and you don't have that kind of relationship that Jesus came to establish, we want to encourage you to think seriously about obeying the gospel of Christ. And if you hear that and you think, I don't really know what is involved in that, well, I want to encourage you to do something. I want to encourage you to come and to talk to me. And we'll look at what the Bible says about that. The Bible doesn't contain mere unproven words. It contains words that are verified by the kinds of things that we talked about. Signs and wonders and miracles that gave proof to the fact that the people who spoke these words and recorded them for us weren't just making it up as they went along or just telling us whatever they wanted us, to believe. But they were speaking from God, and they were giving his message. And what we strive to do is we strive to go back to that book and just take it for what it says. We don't want to make it up as we go along. We don't want to substitute our will for what is found there. And so if you have some questions, let's talk about those, and let's go to the Bible and do that. But if you already know from past studies what the Lord requires of you, and you've not yet done it, then why not this morning? Why not submit to Jesus, the Son of God, the one who is the mighty miracle worker, because God was with him. And more than that, he was God in human flesh. And so if you have some need this morning, we ask that you come as we stand and as we sing.
Have you a heart that's willing?